I'm Karthik Ramanna, a professor at Oxford University's Blavatnik School of Government and the co-developer of the e-liability method for carbon accounting. This video is intended to be viewed as a companion to the Harvard Business Review article titled "Do Recycled Raw Materials Generate Greener Products?" The video is not self-contained, so viewers are advised to first read the article linked in the description before they proceed to this video. In the video, we elaborate on Exhibit 2 of the article to briefly explain how the various companies involved in this pilot engaged in e-liability calculations for their products. Since one of the months covered by this pilot was January 2023, we have represented stylized data from that month. The data are camouflaged to protect the company's competitively sensitive information, so viewers are cautioned not to draw conclusions from the actual levels of emissions data reported. The first company in this fictionalized supply chain is Boliden, the Swedish entity associated with copper cathode production. For the purposes of this example, Boliden sources raw copper in three ways to make its cathodes: from the third-party mines in other countries, from its own mines in Sweden, and through the recycling of electronic waste. The respective products from these three inputs are represented as products 1, 2, and 3 in the table. Importantly, the three products do not have to physically contain the distinctly sourced copper atoms, since copper from the three different sources is fungible in use. Rather, the e-liability method ensures that the total quantity of each product type is equal to the total copper sourced of that type, consistent with the physical principle of mass balancing and the first law of thermodynamics. The second company in this chain is Elcowire, which purchases the copper cathodes produced by Boliden and converts them into copper wire rods. The third company is Dahren, which takes the copper rods and converts them into enamel copper wires. And the fourth company is Hitachi Energy, which takes the copper wires and winds them as part of many other complex activities to produce the electric transformer. That electric transformer is eventually used in Boliden mines, which is something we will cover as well, but let's start with Boliden. For illustrative purposes, we have stylized the various operations at Boliden into just 4 activities, represented under column A of the table as purchases, mining, recycling, and refining. For each of these activities, Boliden first calculates the total emissions in each month, here January, using inputs from environmental engineers. These data are represented in column B. And in column C, the total monthly capacity for each of those activities is also reported in relevant units. For instance, with purchases, the total input capacity of acquired third-party copper for January 2023 is shown as 150,000 tons. Likewise, the total capacity for direct mining activities, e-waste recycling activities, and refining activities for the month of January is shown in hours, here 700 hours for each. In column D, what you see is simply the division of column B by column C, which gives the emissions per unit usage of each of those 4 input activities. This is to say, for example, that the usage of 1 ton of third-party purchased copper is associated with 875 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. Likewise, the usage of each hour of direct mining is associated with 11,905 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. These input usages from column D are then allocated to the individual products, of which there are 3 in this table. Product 1 is the standard copper cathode made from third-party purchased raw copper. Product 2 is the low-carbon copper cathode made directly from copper mined in Sweden. And product 3 is the e-waste copper cathode made from recycled electronic waste. Since purchases is an activity exclusively associated with standard copper, all of the emissions from purchasing are allocated to product 1. To make that allocation, what's crucial is the value in column E, which is the units of that input of purchases needed for 1 unit of product 1. So, what the value for the purchases row in column E is saying is that 1 ton of standard copper cathode requires 4 tons of raw copper concentrate purchased from third-party mines. These drivers are supplied by local production engineers. Then, what you see in column F is simply the product of columns D and E, which is the total emissions for 1 unit of product 1, or 1 ton of standard copper. Likewise, mining is an activity associated exclusively with product 2. So all of the mining emissions are allocated to low-carbon copper cathodes. Column G, for the mining row, reports the number of hours of mining needed to produce 1 ton of low-carbon copper cathode, and that number can be multiplied by the value in column D to get what is the total emissions for 1 ton of low-carbon copper cathode. The same process is repeated for the recycling activity. The fourth activity here is refining, which applies to all 3 output products. Here, the driver of refining across all 3 products is the same, which is to say that 1 ton of output of products 1, 2, or 3 requires 0.01 hours of refining. And by multiplying that driver by the value in column D, you get the corresponding emissions values in columns F, H, and J for refining. When you add up all of the respective values in columns F, H, and J, you get the total emissions associated with each of the 3 types of products at Boliden: standard copper, low carbon copper, and recycled electronic waste copper, which is what you see in the cells marked in blue. Those are the values transferred to the next company in the supply chain, Elcowire, when the respective products are sold. So what you now see labeled as purchases in the first row of the Elcowire table is simply the transferred e-liabilities of the 3 input products at Elcowire. In the table, Elcowire has 2 further activities beyond purchasing, which are melting and waste management. Much like in the case of Boliden, in Elcowire, there are total emissions per month associated with these activities. These are in column B. There's also a total input capacity per month for these 2 activities, reported in column C, which gives you an emissions per unit usage of these input activities, reported in column D. Similarly, there are drivers in columns E, G, and I, which can be used to multiply the values in column D to get the total emissions associated with the 3 Elcowire products at the end of its production process. So, as Elcowire has taken the 3 types of copper cathodes and converted them into 3 types of copper wire rods, you can see that each ton of these copper rods is now associated with the emissions values, or e-liabilities, represented in blue in the last line of the Elcowire table. This process continues to the next company in the chain, which is Darren. Beyond purchases, there are 2 further activities at Darren, which are enameling and equipment depreciation. Equipment depreciation is simply an allocation of the emissions associated with capital equipment used in the production process at Darren. And in much the same way as before, you can calculate the 3 emissions values for each of the 3 products at Darren, which is represented in blue in the last line of that table. The final step in this stylized value chain involves Hitachi Energy, where the previous company's product level e-liabilities once again becomes the input for the purchases row. For Hitachi, 3 activities are represented beyond purchasing: winding, assembling, and plant depreciation. As in the previous 3 examples, there are monthly emissions associated with each of these activities. There's also an input capacity associated with each of these activities, which gives you an emissions factor per unit usage of that input. Then, there are drivers associated in columns E, G, and I, which when multiplied by the emissions per unit in column D, will give you the total emissions for 1 unit of product for each of those input activities. As before, all of the values in columns F, H, and J, respectively, will be added up to give you the sum totals in blue, which are the e-liabilities for Hitachi's products 1, 2, and 3, which are all transformers. An interesting feature of this pilot is that those Hitachi products themselves are inputs into Boliden's production process, as the Hitachi transformers are used in Boliden mines. This type of circularity is common in many value chains, and the e-liability method harnesses it to make carbon accounting calculations more accurate with each iteration. In the first iteration of this pilot, the emissions associated with the depreciation of those transformers in the mining of Boliden copper were not represented. But in the second iteration, they can be represented. And that means that the emissions data that comes out of the second iteration will be more accurate than the data that came out of the first iteration. This is an illustration of the computational principle of recursion that is at the heart of the e-liability algorithm. The e-liability algorithm basically works by taking what seems like an insurmountable problem, which is how do you calculate the total emissions for every product or service in the economy in every time period, and breaks it down into smaller subproblems which can be reasonably solved. So, in the first instance, we simply ignored the depreciation of emissions associated with the transformers in Boliden mines. But in the second iteration of this exercise, we have that transformer-level emissions data. So the data from Boliden can be made that much more accurate. You can see how this recursive process, together with addition across subsequent iterations of new input activities, makes the emissions data for products and services that much more accurate with each period. And throughout, each company using the approach need only know the direct emissions from its own activities for a given period, together with the emissions embedded in the inputs purchased from its immediate suppliers. And that, in a nutshell, is how the e-liability algorithm can quickly scale out worldwide to incentivize decarbonization.